All right, this is the Underside of Power with your hosts, Mark.
And Sean, welcome to this week's episode on the very interesting topic of the Alberta election that we just had here.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of recap what happened, the official results are released today, April 18th, and the UCP has completely crushed the NDP, taking back a supermajority in the legislature with 63 seats to the NDP's 24 seats, with no other party remaining in the legislature.
Yeah, so we now have that UCP majority with a fairly strong NDP opposition, and of course the Liberals in the Alberta Party having no seats remaining, having won no seats in this most recent election. So we've got a two-party legislature with a very strong Conservative majority, kind of as we maybe would have expected with the unification of the two right-wing parties that split the vote 4 years ago in 2015.
Yeah, I guess the funny part is that it doesn't matter how many of your candidates put their foot in their mouths, how many of them say completely terrible, bigoted things, you still can take the legislature in Alberta based off that. Because as it turns out, when people are out of work, they don't really give a shit about those things. It appears to be there's a rank sum order of what people are going to vote on.
Yeah, so despite all the controversy, despite all the scandal, UCP has been elected and it didn't seem to even bog them down that much. So we'll wait and see what comes of some of those scandals and what happens with some of those controversial aspects of the party and their leader. But I think maybe before that, we can kind of go into what set the stage for this election, the most recent leaders debate, the policies that were mentioned and the kind of the things they focused on there, and kind of how this set the stage for the way the election unfolded, because I think a lot can be learned in terms of how the campaigns were conducted and maybe why the UCP had an edge on the Notley campaign in what ways with the kind of rhetoric they were using.
Yeah, because we watched the leaders debate together a couple of weeks ago, shortly after it was aired.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that kind of struck both of us, and I guess looking back on it now, it seems almost prophetic, that, Kenny was always on the offensive. He always had an opening statement. He always had a line or a platitude to deliver. Notley seemed tired. She seemed a little bit too polished.
She seemed kind of rehearsed.
She seemed a little rehearsed. And I can only imagine that hurt her chances. And I think that the thing, what the leaders' debate kind of neatly encapsulated in a microcosm, was that the NDP are really bad at messaging. And it's kind of astonishing to me just how out of touch they were.
Yeah, I find it funny the gap between how much their policies are in line with the wishes of Albertans and at the same time their inability to explain that. They seem to have a really hard time showing people that they're on their side, which is unfortunate because the things they focused on in the debate and in the campaign were actually largely uncontroversial things. They didn't really focus on what was at stake, the real policy differences between the two parties. I don't know if they thought these policy differences were too complicated for the regular people to understand, but their messaging really did not show how much they are in line with the average person. And I think had they harnessed that, people would have really realized that most of their interests are better represented by the NDP.
And right. And so the thing that probably the one issue that I found probably permeated this entire election is pipelines, pipelines, pipelines.
Yes, and the related jobs and other things that come along with that.
Because, of course, for those who may not know, Alberta is Canada's leading oil producer of all the provinces. We produce something upwards of 80% of all oil produced in the country. Most of it comes out of the oil sands or the tar sands, bitumen, which we are world leaders in the production of synthetic crude, which is the upgrading of bitumen into more portable forms of synthetic crude oil, which we then ship worldwide. In 2015, 99% of those exports going to the United States. And the thing about the pipeline rhetoric that I want to get into and I find interesting, and there's a lot to unpack just in that one portfolio, is it just me, or does it seem like a dead end? And it seems
A little
like
bit.
they're just trying to buy time before, the inevitable economic collapse and the world moving away from oil and gas.
And you know what's funny to me is virtually every party in this election, certainly the two parties that stood a chance of winning, trying to out-pipeline each other. There was this huge trend throughout the whole debate, throughout the whole campaign of both parties saying, well, we have the ability to get this pipeline in and pushed through faster and better than the other party does. And neither the NDP or the Conservatives ever said that they were against the pipeline or ever gave any evidence in their policy that they would have been against the pipeline. But both sides accused the other of being somehow not able to get it through. So Kenny pretends that Notley doesn't actually want to get the pipeline through, even though, of course, she fought for it and at this point is out of her control. And then Notley almost did the same thing back to Kenny, where she cited his experience in the federal government and the federal government being under the Conservatives while the Alberta government was under the Progressive Conservatives. And during that 10 or so year period, and them not being able to get through the Keystone pipeline or the Northern Gateway. And so Notley's saying, well, you can't get them through, Kenny. And then Kenny's saying to Notley, well, no, you're the one who can't get them through. And there's this out-pipelining each other. And this is why I mentioned that Notley really failed to focus on the actual controversial issues in this election. What a lot of Albertans have not realized, because NDP didn't highlight it, is that the pipeline wasn't the controversy here. Both parties wanted it, which I found it funny how they wanted to bicker about it. So
And
that's,
so
I think
one
key.
thing that we need to address specifically is why the recent pipelines haven't been going through. So I think specifically the transatlantic
Exactly, yeah.
that runs to the East Coast, or that was going to run to the East Coast. And then the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain expansion through to Burnaby through BC. Both of these pipelines were essentially stymied, and ultimately the Kinder Morgan pipeline needed to be purchased by the federal government, or at least the land that it's going to be built on was purchased by the government, or the pipeline that is there was purchased by the federal government, something along those lines. And I guess the question is that, so why wouldn't British Columbia want a pipeline expansion going through the backwoods of their territory?
Yeah, why don't we begin with that? Kind of the obvious elements of, well, what are the downsides? Why are these provinces kind of pushing back?
And if I could just say one thing, is that how come nobody has talked about the downsides of these pipelines? Because, like, for instance, Alberta has over 1,000 major environmental emissions a year as a result of pipelines. And it wasn't too long ago that the Husky energy pipeline, I don't remember where along the route it burst, but it dumped however many tens of thousands of barrels of oil into the North Saskatchewan River. These failures happen all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is that's why I termed it kind of the more obvious detriments, because I think there's a lot more nuanced ones we can get to in a moment. But what we have to realize as not just Albertans but Canadians is that it's not necessarily in the interest of these provinces to have this happen. There are other ways to get our oil or our synthetic crude, which isn't technically oil, to get it to match the price of other oil producers around the world. One of them is a pipeline, but there's other alternatives, and I think what BC and others want is us to consider there's other alternatives that don't involve risking these kind of spills on their territory.
And so that's kind of, to me, it sort of strikes to me as a red herring, because it sort of strikes me that instead of just shipping out all of this synthetic crude, if we can't get everyone to agree to a pipeline, Obama basically vetoed the Keystone expansion.
Yep.
BC doesn't want the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain to go through.
And now that one's going through the courts,
and
which will take some time.
And will ultimately fail. In my opinion, I'm almost certain it's going to fail. And then the transatlantic was vetoed by Quebec for the same reasons as quoted with British Columbia. So my question is then, okay, so we can't get these pipelines through to ship the synthetic crude. How come nobody has been talking about upgrading capacity?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that in Alberta, we have a lot of upgraders that just go from bitumen to upgraded bitumen, also known as synthetic crude, just so that it can be shipped. Synthetic bitumen is not a final product. It's an intermediate product. It cannot be used in any kind of application. So what we're doing is shipping an unfinished product, and we're claiming that if we ship more of it and ship it faster, well, then we can sell it for the same price as the fully upgraded product. Sure, that's true. The pipeline would get us to a price where it would be reasonable to rely on a resource economy, but there's an alternative. Instead of shipping more of a worse product, we can still ship the same amount of a better product, and I think that's something we should be kind of focusing on here. Do you have those figures handy on the comparative upgrading that we do in Alberta versus other places? Because it's kind of a big issue here. We do have a very large lack and deficiency in terms of upgrading in Alberta.
Yeah, I don't have the comparative values in front of me here, but I do have our internal values, which is that we upgrade approximately 1,280,000 barrels of bitumen a day, but we only fully refine and upgrade approximately 500,000 of it. So over approximately, so we take 39% of what we produce and actually turn it into usable fuels, other lightweight hydrocarbons like ethanes, petroleum waxes, in some cases even asphalt as well. But I do know that there is a single refinery in Kentucky, actually. And to be fair, it is the third largest refinery in the United States, which is a much larger country than ours, a much larger nation.
And now the largest oil producer in the world.
And there's a single refinery in Kentucky that that upgrades far more than we do. I'll try and pull up the numbers here if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I've noticed with this whole pipeline issue is that a lot of politicians want to be able to ride on this pipeline issue as a low investment, a quick build, and a quick return. So they see it as a very low risk way to get our oil prices up. Because frankly, as long as we're depending on the resource, we do need to get those prices up, and pipeline is one way to do that. However, if you invest more in off the top, we can have a greater return on that investment later on. I think governments are scared to do that because the deficit is often used in political talking points against whichever party is in power, and neither of them wants to have that deficit spending to get this thing started. But it's a real legitimate alternative that doesn't require shipping more things. And like I said, we can ship the same amount of a better product and still, close that gap of our value of our oil. And I think it's a lot of fear. I think it's a lot of electoral kind of rhetoric-based issues around this, where they're scared of, if we go this alternate route that isn't the pipeline route, well, we may lose some capital with the people. And I think that's just short-sighted. We should be really focusing on the long term here and how we're actually going to get this to work over the next few decade or two, instead of just focusing on, what's the cheapest way to get our oil to market as quickly as possible. And that's why I'm saying for the meantime, I can't be opposed to the oil economy. We're dependent on it for now until we diversify, but there's a way to go about this that's different from pipelines, and I think that's pretty key.
Right, and I was slightly incorrect. It was actually in Indiana, and it's the Whiting refinery, and this single refinery in Indiana upgrades nearly as much oil, or refines nearly as much oil as our entire province does. And we're one of the leading producers of synthetic crude in the world. We are the leading producer of synthetic crude in the world. But
yep, exactly. So plenty of our synthetic crude is being shipped to refineries such as this one to be upgraded outside of Canada. It's just a huge missed opportunity for us where frankly, we should have invested decades ago when oil was worth more, when we were pulling in way bigger revenues, when we were posting surpluses in our budget. That's when we should have invested. But now I think it might still, not be too late. We might still have just a little bit of a window of time here to do that. So I think it's really a shame that all they do is focus on the pipeline, and it's become such a central topic in this election. And I do want to move past that fairly soon, just to get into the other kind of more contentious issues. But I just find it very funny, and I think these numbers show in terms of how little we actually refine into a final product and how much we refine into an intermediate product. Just how silly this pipeline focus is, and just how much Notley and Kenny were using it for political talking points.
And right, so moving on to maybe one of the other really big issue in the election was on the topic of the UCP's proposed Bill 10, which it's an amendment to whatever the Primary Education Act in Alberta is that sort of governs primary and secondary schools. And essentially what the big issue was is that what it would do is it would require schools that host gay straight alliances to basically out students to their parents for their involvement in those clubs. And so there was a great big eruption around the LGBT plus bigotry of the UCP party and its candidates. I'm thinking specifically of Mark Smith, who he was one of the candidates for the Drayton Valley Devon riding. And there was a sermon that he did back in 2013 that came to light where he's comparing, like, he was comparing homosexuality to pedophilia. He was saying that people misused the term love in order to justify having abortions and stuff. Just really horrible stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard the recording, but
I've seen it documented. I've seen articles on it, and I think we can see it goes all the way to the leader himself. Of course, Kenny has a history of this stuff. A lot of us have seen the article that went around about him talking about how gays should marry heterosexually. And then the issues with the San Francisco hospital visitation issue. This has really been in his history for a while, and now it's kind of pervaded the party. And back to the debate, I think we even saw it with his answer to the question, did we not? When he was asked about this issue specifically.
So the specific question was, why is inclusion an important issue for the province? Which of course was oriented around this LGBT and gay straight alliance issue. And what was his answer exactly?
Well, after every other candidate goes and he was last to go, you have all three candidates ahead of him saying, we believe in the rights of all minority groups, and especially this LGBTQ group who's threatened by this kind of Bill 10 issue and any kind of erosion of their rights. And then Kenny goes on and explicitly, directly focuses on racial and religious minorities. I saw it as kind of like a reverse dog whistle in a way. It's a very subtle wink and a nod to his base that, he's worried about, and he focuses on his time as immigration minister under Stephen Harper and saying, well, I'm very progressive on racial minorities and religious minorities like Muslims and Hindus. And then he says, and Christians. He includes Christians and religious minorities as another kind of, olive branch to his base. And he goes on and on about racial and religious minorities and how we need to worry about them. They're the real problem. And his first answer actually doesn't touch upon the LGBTQ community at all. To me, that's a wink to his base. And then when he gets a follow-up question on this in the longer debate part of this, he does say that, my Bill 10 is not intended to be applied too widely. It's only, in specific cases. And then he goes on to refer to in these groups, like the Gay Straight Alliances, the chances of mental illness that has to be reported or confusion that should be reported to parents. Again, kind of implying that a lot of these kids, according to him, have problems that their parents need to know about. And I get it if it's about like field trips that are unauthorized, taking kids away from school, which he did cite. I believe he cited that in debate, if not in articles.
He has a single anecdotal example.
Yes, of that one girl who was taken to that some kind of gay rights event. Mm-hmm. Sure, you don't take your kids out of school for an unauthorized field trip. That's a problem. But this is not, I don't think, what the object of the bill is. And the way he talked about it in the debate actually was very different from the actual content. I find it interesting how he kind of backpedaled away from it. But we had a lot of weird stuff with the social issues in this election with Kenny because he never really, I don't think he ever really proved himself to be any reformed from the way he used to be.
But it doesn't matter, I think, is the key point. I think that the issue is that the NDP, they really did have so little to show on the economic front because, they weren't very economically progressive. They didn't do a whole lot to diversify the energy economy of the province. I haven't even heard a whisper of geothermal. Wind is pretty much at where it's at. Solar did take an increase of 500%, but is still a negligible part of the energy economy. And so what kind of disappointed me with the NDP is that they honestly thought that they were going to be able to ride this social issue and drag Kenny and his candidates to the point that they would actually be able to take the legislature. But that's not how it works.
And I care about it a lot, and I think Kenny probably does have some bigotry around these issues for sure. I mean, his history proves that. I think his answers to some of the questions indicate that. Not explicitly, but when you really dig into it, I think you can see what he was really saying there. So I care about this stuff, but you're right. The focus on it shows that it's the only basket they've put their eggs into. I really, really don't understand why she didn't focus on the parts of the economy that were diversified. The solar panel legislation that was put in, the increase in solar energy is important. The extreme budgetary mismanagement that Jason Kenney is proposing in his platform, explicitly proposing. I have some figures on the kind of tax cuts that he was proposing that are just fascinating because of how much it's going to hurt our revenue. This is what she could have focused on. If she only focused on the actual economic detriments of a Jason Kenney premiership, that's something that would have resonated, but she just tried to completely sidestep economic issues. The only thing she said in terms of economy was that she's pro-pipeline. Oh, so what? Both of you are. There's no difference there. And Kenny managed to convince everyone that she was anti-pipeline anyway, somehow. So I don't know. Why didn't she focus on the real, this is what I mean, the controversial issues. What was actually controversial in this election, she never actually brought up.
I do want to get to that, because I think that she did to an extent, because she did open in the debate by saying something in along the lines of, and if I can actually pull it up here, I wrote it down, that essentially that, Jason Kenney, he wants to cut schools, he wants to cut healthcare, and he wants to put it in the pockets of his rich friends. That's true. Of course it is. But the thing is that if the criticism against you is that you're driving up the deficit and this is going to fundamentally damage the economy, which, by the way, governments are actually they don't need to actually balance deficits technically. There might be an argument that a provincial government has to, but as modern monetary theory states, is that it is actually possible to print money, spend it on specific, what's the term I'm looking for here? Specific initiatives in order to promote growth. And that so long as your deficit is balanced by money in a broad range of people's bank accounts, and the dollar velocity, so the rate at which a specific dollar is spent, is reasonably high, then you can actually run a deficit with no problems. And actually, Japan is a brilliant example of this, where there could, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are literally quadrillions of yen in debt, and their economy, it runs perfectly fine.
So yeah, she really should have focused on the fact that not so much, that Kenny was going to cut social services, which is very important, and to me that's the number one priority for me in this election that I was voting based on, that I was thinking about the entire time, but also the kind of mismanagement she was accused of. Why, first of all, it's not full mismanagement, and secondly, Kenny is kind of guilty of the same mismanagement in the same way. With the current plan that Kenny has, it will require deficit spending. It will not result in a balanced budget, and this is something she could have focused on. This is something she really could have wrote out and really could have used to her benefit to mention, oh yeah, Kenny is planning on deficit spending. He's explicitly mentioned how he's going to reduce our revenues in this province without explaining where that money is going to come from in terms of cuts. Because honestly, with the revenue that we have right now and the proposed revenue that we'll have under Kenny, you can't cut enough to balance the budget. If you were to cut enough with our current revenue to balance the budget, you wouldn't have enough money to fund schools and healthcare. So the way Kenny has set up this platform is going to involve deficit spending. It's really unfortunate. And this is why I think both of us kind of enjoyed David Kahn's contribution to this debate, pointing out all the silly talking points of Notley and Kenny, mostly Kenny though, and saying well, look, you guys don't have a very good reputation for balancing the budget either, whether it's under Harper or under the previous progressive conservative government in Alberta. And the Heritage Fund being raided and hardly being very large in the first place because of the lack of royalties imposed on the oil sands is the same kind of mismanagement that you're accusing the NDP of doing. So there's all this hypocrisy, all these talking points, and Kahn was the one who was actually serious about hey guys, we need to actually be serious about the budget, how we're going to get our revenues, what we're going to do about them, and how to spend it.
Hey, you can't do a referendum on equalization payments as a basis for which to bring a constitutional challenge to the federal government
Yeah,
was another thing that he brought up.
exactly. I mean, this is the thing that Khan was so adept at pointing out the whole time, especially being a constitutional lawyer with that specific issue. I think
Take a drink.
He brought a lot of knowledge to that. He really was good at focusing on the things that were important, because Kenny and Notley were trying to point score, and he often accused Kenny of playing political theater, playing to the fears of Albertans and point scoring, whereas Khan was like, okay, look, we have to be serious about these issues. How are we going to diversify the economy, and how are we going to improve our revenues and reduce our spending to a reasonable degree? And neither Notley or Kenny really have a plan for that. So what do? They talk about pipelines, and they talk about in Notley's case, this guy is so anti-social progressivism, and in Kenny's case, Notley is so pro-Trudeau, which was one of the most interesting attacks. So they use all these like talking points. You're pro-Trudeau. You're anti-gay. But they never actually get to, hey, by the way, both of their economic plans result in huge mismanagement. And obviously the Conservatives a lot more than the NDP. But they I don't know. There's just this focus on things that score points rather than things that actually matter.
So I'll admit that towards the end of this election, and maybe I had a premonition, I entered just a bit of a Zen-like state of peace towards the end, because I kind of came to the realization is that I didn't actually care who won the election, knowing full well that the UCP winning was not going to be good. But I was also convinced that the NDP winning wasn't going to be very good either. And the reason why I say that is, of course, we've identified with the UCP. Like, by and large, they're a party of bigots, not only in terms of LGBT lines, but if Kaylin Ford, the former candidate for Calgary Mountain View, who was outed as espousing belief in the Great Replacement, also known as white genocide, also known as the ideology the Christchurch shooter had as well, it's going to be a bad time. When the Progressive Conservatives were ruling this province, it was also a similarly bad time if you weren't wealthy or working in the oil patch. But at least we had enough of an artificially inflated economy to keep things going on. And I'm actually kind of glad that the UCP won, because when inevitably they mismanage the economy, when inevitably they're unable to get pipelines through, when inevitably they
run huge deficits,
when they inevitably lose every single constitutional challenge they make, they're going to be left holding the bag again. And my prediction is, and my hope is that this will result in a splintering of the right wing in the province again.
And that's a very interesting thing I'm waiting for, because the UCP is an artificial party, which has to be kept in mind.
Well, that, and I was going to add something to that they're going to splinter again, and that also it's going to delegitimize conservative economic politics for a generation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a real benefit that can come out of that. I think we've seen it kind of with Trump's Republicans in the States, because Trump's very honest about the kind of things that they do, whereas, maybe Romney or W. Bush weren't as honest, better at covering it up, might make people wiser to it. And I think we might see the same thing here. I agree that when the UCP won, I was not too surprised. I was a little bit upset, but, not too necessarily worried for the long run, because you're right. When people realize that the pipeline issue is not actually within the legislature's control, it's currently a judicial issue, and it doesn't get through under Kenny, well, then they'll know. The provincial government currently has no control over it. When we have more deficit spending under Kenny than the previous Conservative government had, because of the kind of revenue erosion he's doing, then we'll know that we do need a level of deficit spending in Alberta because our revenue is so low. So these kind of things should, and also the stupid trickle-down, 8% corporate tax rate, lowest in Canada, he wants to implement. This will not actually create more jobs. It will not be the boost he expects. It will only hurt our revenues. When these things start to come through, we might just see the test be failed by Kenny. And this is really what I really want to kind of see over the next few years. And finally, I'm very interested to see what happens with the UCP in terms of it being a party. I would not be surprised if another right-wing party breaks off from it. in the next few years, maybe 1 or 2 terms. But the party's hardly holding itself together as it is. I don't think there's a lot of cohesion in that party.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I don't know how much time we have left, but that kind of brings us to the kamikaze candidate, Jeff Callaway, who essentially was insofar as we know, was a plant by the Kenney leadership campaign to undercut Brian Jean for the leadership of the UCP, where there's an RCMP probe going on. There is the elections commissioner is still looking into it.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually may have an illegitimate premier now. And that's interesting to say the least. And actually, like, the evidence is pretty, like, smack down, right? Like, you had Happy Man, who was I guess he was a solicitor with Harper and Associates in Calgary, where there was emails revealed that he was in direct conversation with members of Kenney's senior leadership team. That the timing of Callaway dropping out roughly aligns with Mr. Mann's analysis of the events. And that there has already been over $40,000, $50,000 in fines for obstruction of the investigation.
Right, and then you add onto the kamikaze candidate all the false ballots that were cast. And
the VPN issue. Yeah,
massive election fraud case to be had here. So, yeah, I think that speaks to the splintering of the party. It speaks to 2 people in the party, Jean and Kenney, infighting in a very what ended up being a very unfair and fraudulent way. And this is, I think, what we're going to come to expect of the UCP is them undercutting each other when they disagree. This party was based on a mathematical calculation. It was not based on shared ideas.
Who would have thought that reactionaries would be reactive?
Yeah, I know. It's not too surprising to see the end result of this. I can't say I'm surprised. I'm a little disappointed. But this is a lot of the stuff that's happening right now I expected to happen. I'm very interested to see what happens with this stuff over the next few years. And it's just a shame how much rhetoric is poured on with Kenney and how much he talks about things he knows will gain traction without ever actually getting to the core of these issues and explaining really what his plan is.
And I personally hope that the NDP of Alberta, of which they did a lot of really good things. They implemented the $25 per day childcare. Huge success. They offered tuition regulations for post-secondary students.
The tuition freeze was fantastic.
Well, this is Bill 19, not just the tuition freeze, but Bill 19. Fantastic. Excellent piece of legislature.
Minimum wage being increased was
to
fantastic.
$15 an hour. Huge success.
Really excellent idea.
The carbon levy was even a huge success because it did actually start the process of energy diversification in Alberta. Like I said, solar power increased by 500%. Less than half of our power comes from coal-powered plants now. Those are tremendous successes. And anybody who says otherwise, honestly, I don't want to say, just ignore them and discount them from the conversation, but maybe take what they have to say with a grain of salt. And I really do hope that this becomes a soul-searching enterprise for the NDP party in Alberta. I hope that 4 years out of power, or God forbid a by-election is called because the premier is illegitimate, I just hope that they will come to recognize that, maybe oil companies and their executives are a kind of evil. Maybe they'll recognize that the continued dependence on one resource doesn't do us any favors, and that maybe they can come forward with an actual bold progressive plan for this province, aside from, these guys want to out gay kids. Yeah, that's horrible. But the thing about the people of Alberta is that, as was demonstrated,
it might not land with them.
They just don't care.
Yeah, and I think what the NDP needs to focus on in the future, and what I'm really proud of them for, what I was focusing on this election, maybe the number one issue for me, was public spending on education and healthcare and these kinds of things. To see the level of spending that they've done is really a lesson that when we're running a deficit, it's not so much the deficit itself that we should be worried about, having a deficit is bad, not having one is good, but rather what it's being spent on. And the NDP really focused on spending in the right areas. That the healthcare and education spending they've done have caused a lot of benefits. And in Ontario, the cuts to education have caused a lot of problems. And now we're seeing, if you've seen the headlines recently under Doug Ford, we do have class sizes slated to increase tremendously. And I believe the last headline I saw said thousands, above 1,000 layoffs for teachers because of the education cuts. So this is the stuff that's at stake. This is stuff they have to package, not, I'm more in favor of the pipeline than he is. Sure, say that. Sure, you're in favor of the pipeline. Everyone knows that. You're a premier in Alberta, of course. But focus on what your government is spending on and what the Conservatives will cut spending to. Focus on the people you're going to help and fiscally and economically, and the people that the Conservatives are not going to help. Because what we've seen with the tax plan, and this is the biggest thing for me, is where you're getting your revenue from and how you're going to spend it. The Conservatives are saving a lot of money for the corporations, and they're going to make up for that lost revenue with cuts for regular people, cuts for social spending. And this is the real concern for me, is now what we're going to see is belt tightening. Austerity measures and trickle-down economics will become business as usual in Alberta for the next 4 years. And we've already seen Kenny promise a 1% corporate tax reduction every year for the next 4 years. So this year, 1%, followed by 2, 3, 4. And I calculated it. That blows a $2.5 billion hole in the deficit. Tremendously large amount of lost revenue. So what are we going to do for our schools and our Sean,
hospitals? You forgot one thing, though. A rising tide lifts all boats.
Well, let's see how trickle down works in Alberta, and if it works here when it hasn't succeeded anywhere else, and then we can reevaluate that hypothesis of the rising tide. I'm just blown away by this whole. This is the main thing for me is like, I get it about the social issues, the pipeline issue. I know you want to focus on that, but get those out there, mention them, push it through, show how you're, the same or better than Kenny on those issues, and then focus on, what is Kenny going to do to your kids in school, which everyone's kid has to go to public school. So what are they going to deal with for the next, few years of their public school experience, and how is that going to change with a Kenny government? Austerity measures are dangerous, and this is the thing we have to be on the lookout for, I think.
And for the love of God, just say geothermal once. It would just get me so hot.
Yeah, talk about something that we can rely on in the economy other than oil for once. Even bring up the solar thing, bring up geothermal, something, please. It's really a shame. Whoever was advising on the policy priorities to focus on in these speeches and debates may have made a few glaring errors there.
So I think that kind of roundly completes the time that we have today. And next week, I kind of want to talk about the history of oil in Alberta. It's kind of where I'm at these days.
I'd be really interested in talking about that, because I think that's another thing the NDP should have focused on, is the mismanagement over time and how they inherited a big shitty situation that wasn't necessarily their fault. I think that's pretty key, so we can touch on that. But very excited to see what happens with the UCP and to keep track on their plan. I want to see this get tested and see the results, and judge them based on those results.
Wonderful. Well, then, this has been the Underside of Power with Marc
and Sean. So thank you guys very much for joining us today, and keep an eye out for our future Alberta politics discussions. They're going to be really interesting, I think, from here on out.